1. The blurring of boundaries. Radical skepticism towards objective truth and knowledge, combined with the belief that systems are constructed in the service of power, results in a suspicion of the boundaries and categories we have generally accepted as true. This includes the boundaries between objective and subjective, as well as those between the science and the arts, especially for Lyotard, the natural and the artificial, high and low culture, man and other animals, man and machine for Deleuze, and different understandings of sexuality and gender, as well as health and sickness, see especially Foucault. All of these thinkers treat the boundaries between these things as fluid.
Okay. I don't know if we want to inject in between each of these four. It's close to the end of this. So anything on blurring of the boundaries?
I did have a real world example of this. I recently got into it with a dude who was trying to make the claim that biological sex is on a spectrum. And I think there's a lot of these statistical terms that they'll try to use. They'll blur the boundaries of what the statistical term means. And spectrum is a big that they'll try to use. And they'll use the evidence of any outlier in the world and try to show that means spectrum. I was like, no, there things can be binary and have, outliers. So then he tried to convince me that maybe it's not a spectrum, but maybe it's bimodal. And things like binary, I would say sex is probably pretty binary with obviously some variations. If you're looking for something that's bimodal, you look for something like height. You're going to have two modes, and it's going to be height of males versus height of females, which one of my favorite YouTube clips is Heather Haying getting booed off stage because she claimed that men are generally taller than women.
Heather, you are an evolutionary biologist. What can we take from what Helen said to help us make sense of James's memo?
James argues, accurately, that there are differences between men and women. This is a strange position to be in, to be arguing for something that is so universally and widely accepted within biology. What is not as widely accepted is that culture is also evolutionary, but I'm going to argue that biology and culture are both evolutionary. Let's look at differences between men and women that are explicitly anatomical and physiological. Are men taller than women on average? Does anyone take offense at that fact? Are you irritated?
There's always a standout.
So I would say you could be irritated by it. You could be irritated by the fact that women have to be the ones to gestate and lactate. You could be irritated by a lot of truths. But taking offense is a response that is rejection of reality. So men and women are different on height. They're different on muscle mass. They're different on where fat is deposited on our bodies, right? Our brains are also different. So there's some binaries.
Oh, wow. Security! This is what happens. Oh, did they shut off the volume? Can you hear? Can everybody hear?
Piece of shit. That is not okay. Even the women in there have been brainwashed.
Should not listen to fascism. It should not be tolerated in civil society. Nazis are not welcome in civil society.
Fuck the police! Cover the people! Thank you.
I know more of this is coming up, and later in the book, they're really going to get into this, especially in queer theory.
With us understanding the knowledge and power principles, how are boundaries, because it seems like they're trying to do away with boundaries, how are boundaries a violation of the knowledge principle and the power principle? Or how do they play into those?
They're just human constructs. They're not real, according to them, and they're devised with power in mind, with how those who are in power might want to see or decide or claim the world must be evaluated. And they usually, under that Derridian thing that Helen talked about, they favor one binary to the other. Usually there's one that's othered and one that's the superior in the way of viewing the world, that sort of way. And they do believe, I do believe even the postmodernists have a normative belief, like a prescription, that we should go blurring the boundaries of all these lines because they will help us to see and understand the world in better ways and start to reimagine stuff. Like even Deleuze, like it says that the blurring between machine and human there, that's really some of the start of the transhuman world, that we need to start seeing ourselves as part machine and blurring the lines of them together. And then there's, like anything, there's some validity to those ideas.
I think if you were to say, where do we encounter this most in modern day in social media, certainly the one that's made the biggest footprint is queer theory, and how it takes traditional notions of sex being equivalent or related to gender. This is an older notion, and seeing that idea change where there's a disconnect between sex and gender to varying degrees, to the modern realm where sex and gender are completely disconnected and they are themselves considered to be social constructs for which there's no boundary. You can't conceive of it as a binary. Blasting it apart with the notion of spectrum is the idea that there's these infinite variations therein. And the thing is, anytime you encounter people on that, it's always asserted as a truth claim. And it's asserted as a truth claim that they say has the validity of the science behind it. And that's where you get that disconnect of, wait, do you believe in science and you want to tie yourself to the objective world of science, or do you not believe in those things? And those debates always are less than productive anytime you get into that.
You see some of the other concepts that we hit on earlier, that there's a blurring of the high arts and the low arts. And I think some of that can even be performative by people who understand this stuff, like NPR pretending like they like Cardi B. They're trying to performatively show that they get this.
But it's funny, though, because the blurring of the boundaries may be allowed in some domains, but not others. And the classic paradox there is that, according to queer theory, somebody who may be biologically male can decide that their gender identity is not male and is female or some non-binary expression. Whereas somebody who is biologically white could not do the same thing and say that I want to identify according to a different race. And because of that distinction, now you've got to create a whole new set of justifications and rationalizations why the first one may be allowed, but the second, dealing with race, is not allowed. And it leans in more to the oppression oppressed type thing. But when you think about it more, it doesn't, you have to separate the intersections because you didn't have the full lived experience of a Black person. This is the Rachel Dolezal is the classic example of it. And so you're taking on an oppressed identity and you're exploiting their lived experience. Whereas people saying that's the same thing that a man becoming a woman or asserting that they are a woman is doing. And if you're going to allow one, you have to allow the other. Or if you don't allow one, then you don't allow the other. So if you don't allow a white woman to become a Black woman, then you should not allow a male to become a female.
They're both labeled as social constructs in all this mess, but it is odd that different rules apply to them. And part of me thinks that's just we haven't gotten there yet. I feel like racism is such a sacred cow that to ignore the obvious that there are physical differences between races, like that people look different. I'm honestly surprised it's gotten there with gender, because sexism is another sacred cow. So I don't know if it's headed in that direction. I've wondered if there will be a point in time where we can identify as a different race, but it seems like weaponized anti-racism is too much of a valuable asset to let that aspect of truth go.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense logically all the way down. There are trans exclusionary radical feminists who do try to hold to that same line of lived experiences that somebody might use in an intersectional or a race area. But the book gets into it, like I said, but a lot of people maybe don't understand that the word queer in queer theory is a verb, not a noun. And the idea is we need to culturally mess with this. We need to culturally blur and push on these boundaries. But the level of it that doesn't work in racism, I'd say the answer to both of them, the way they square all the circles, is what maximizes claims of oppression. Like in the gender side of it, the category is the oppressive thing that they're fighting against, whereas in the race category, it's more the race that is the oppressive issue that they're fighting against, even though that gets blurry itself. And in either one of the cases, like the concept of queers, we're going to hold the line that keeps the most political pressure. And that's also true in the critical race theory level.
So I guess it creates a new category of oppression. So I am a trans woman. That creates a new category of oppression. And whereas if I were to say I identify as a Mexican man, that wouldn't create a new identity of oppression. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. If we're able to deconstruct race, it removes oppression. If we have clear lines of constructing sex, it removes oppression. So either one of them, and it's actually in their own writing as theorists, whichever one maximizes the political narrative of oppression is the way to go.
The other point about this is even within, if you just look at the dimension of race, they don't allow you to blur the boundaries between black and white, but they certainly allow you to blur the boundaries between other things that aren't black. And so white adjacent is a concept that I've seen Hispanic people, Indian, Asian people talk about when they construct the concept of whiteness as this privilege that defines oppression of that which is not black. Or if it's weird on where you draw these lines, but they'll blur the heck out of Mexicans and Indians and Asians and lump them in with whiteness. But you can't blur certain aspects of these.
All the contradictions are allowed if they maximize the political principle.
Yes, exactly.